The person I trusted most on my wedding day was the person I should have been watching the closest. I still remember the moment I realized that some smiles hide intentions that words never reveal. My name is Margaret Wilson, and at 67 years old, I thought I understood my family better than anyone. I had spent my entire life believing that loyalty was something you protected, something you carried through every season of life. I never imagined that the person who shared my childhood memories, my family traditions, and my deepest history would become the person who forced me to question everything I believed about trust. My wedding day was supposed to be a new beginning. After losing my husband several years earlier, I never thought I would find love again. But life surprised me. I met someone who reminded me that happiness could still exist after loss. The ceremony was held at a beautiful garden venue in North Carolina, surrounded by flowers, soft music, and the people who mattered most to me. I wore a simple ivory dress, nothing extravagant, because at my age I was not looking for a fairy tale. I was looking for peace. My daughter was smiling beside me. My friends were celebrating. And for a few hours, I felt like I had finally stepped into a chapter of life that I deserved. My older brother Thomas arrived that afternoon wearing a dark suit and the same confident smile he had carried for decades. Growing up, Thomas was always the stronger personality between us. He was louder, more outspoken, and always ready with an opinion. I used to admire that about him. When we were children, I believed he would always protect me. After our parents passed away, we were the last connection to the family we once had. That history meant something to me. I thought it meant something to him too. During the reception, Thomas moved through the room greeting guests and telling stories about our childhood. Everyone laughed. Everyone seemed happy. He looked like the supportive brother I had always wanted him to be. At one point, he walked over to my table and placed a drink in front of me. "You finally deserve to relax," he said with a smile. I thanked him and watched him walk away. It was such a small moment that most people would never remember it. But something about his expression stayed in my mind. It was not what he said. It was the way he looked at me afterward, as if he was waiting for something. I did not react. I did not want to create a scene at my own wedding. I simply placed the drink aside and continued enjoying the evening. I smiled for pictures. I talked with guests. I danced with my new husband, but a quiet feeling followed me through the night. It was the same feeling you get when you notice a detail that does not belong, even if you cannot explain why. The next morning, while the house was quiet and the wedding decorations were still waiting to be packed away, I sat at my kitchen table and thought about Thomas. I thought about all the years I had defended him, all the times I had told people, "That is just Thomas being Thomas." I wondered how many moments I had ignored because admitting the truth would have been too painful. I did not know what would happen next. I did not know how much my relationship with my brother would change. But I knew one thing. Something had shifted. And for the first time in my life, I decided I would stop ignoring the signs simply because they came from family. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that I was overthinking everything. That was something I had become very good at throughout my life. Whenever something hurt me, I searched for reasons to make it easier to accept. I told myself people were tired. I told myself they did not mean it that way. I told myself family members sometimes made mistakes. But this time, something felt different. I could not ignore the quiet question that kept returning to my mind. Why did my own brother make me feel like I needed to question a moment that should have been filled with happiness? After the wedding, life slowly returned to normal. The flowers were put away. The chairs were returned to the venue. The photographs started arriving in my inbox from friends and family. Everyone was sharing beautiful memories from that day. When I looked through the pictures, I saw so many moments that made me smile. My daughter, laughing. My husband holding my hand. Friends celebrating a new chapter in my life. But every time I saw Thomas in those pictures, I felt something I could not explain. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was disappointment. Because Thomas was not just my brother. He was someone who had known me longer than almost anyone else in my life. We grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone. Our parents taught us that family was something you protected. When our father passed away, Thomas and I became even closer for a while. We helped our mother through difficult years. We shared memories that nobody else could understand. I thought those experiences created a bond that could never be broken. Looking back now, I realized there were signs I had chosen not to see. Thomas always had a way of making himself the center of attention. At family gatherings, every conversation eventually became about his achievements, his opinions, or his problems. I never minded listening. That was simply the role I played in my family. I was the person who listened. I was the person who forgave. I was the person who kept everyone connected. But over the years, his jokes started feeling different. When I decided to move forward with my life after losing my first husband, Thomas laughed and said, "I never thought you would start over at your age." Everyone around him smiled, and I laughed too. I did not want anyone to feel uncomfortable. But later that night, I remembered those words. Another time, when I shared exciting news about my new home, Thomas quickly changed the conversation and talked about his own accomplishments. Again, I ignored it. I told myself he was just being himself. That was the explanation I had used for years. But after the wedding, those memories began connecting like pieces of a puzzle. I started seeing a pattern I had avoided for too long. It was not about one moment. It was about many small moments where Thomas made me feel less important than everyone else in the room. One afternoon, my daughter called me to check on how I was feeling. Megan had always been observant. She knew when something was different, even when I tried to hide it. "Mom, are you sure everything is okay?" she asked. I looked out the window at my garden and thought about my answer carefully. I did not want to create conflict. I did not want her to feel caught between family members. "I think I am finally paying attention," I told her. She became quiet. She knew that sentence meant more than I was saying. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table and opened an old family photo album. I looked at pictures of Thomas and me when we were younger. Two children who believed family meant always standing together. I smiled at those memories, but I also accepted something I had avoided for years. A shared past does not always guarantee a shared future. And sometimes the people who know you the longest are the people you expect to understand you the most. I did not know what Thomas had intended at my wedding. I did not have all the answers yet. But I knew I could no longer ignore my own instincts just to protect the image of the family I wished I had. I spent the following week trying to understand what I had missed. I did not want to believe that Thomas could have intentionally crossed a line with me. Not because I was ignoring the truth, but because accepting it meant accepting that someone I loved had changed. Sometimes the hardest part of betrayal is not the action itself. It is realizing that the person you trusted may not have been the person you thought they were. I started paying closer attention to the details I had overlooked before. I went through the photographs from my wedding again. I looked at the timeline of the evening. I remembered conversations that seemed ordinary at the time, but now felt different. There were moments when Thomas seemed more interested in controlling the atmosphere than celebrating with me. He would make small comments and then quickly turn them into jokes. He knew how to say something uncomfortable while making everyone else believe it was harmless. That had always been his talent. He could make people laugh while avoiding responsibility. A few days later, I spoke with an old family friend named Daniel Brooks. Daniel had known our family for many years and had always been someone I respected. He had worked as an attorney in our community, but more importantly, he understood the history between Thomas and me. I did not call him because I wanted to start a fight. I called because I needed someone outside the family to help me see things clearly. We met at a quiet coffee shop near my home in North Carolina. The morning was peaceful. People around us were having conversations, drinking coffee, and starting their day. It felt strange to discuss something so personal in such an ordinary place. I told Daniel everything I remembered. I explained what happened at the wedding, how Thomas had acted afterward, and the feelings I had carried for years, but never expressed. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked at me and said, "Margaret, sometimes the most important thing is not proving what someone intended. It is understanding the impact of what happened and protecting yourself moving forward." His words stayed with me. I had spent so much of my life trying to understand other people's intentions that I rarely considered the effect their actions had on me. I always asked, did they mean to hurt me? But I never asked, why did I allow myself to be hurt repeatedly? Daniel encouraged me to keep a record of everything I remembered. Not because I wanted revenge, but because memories can become unclear when emotions are involved. He told me to save messages, write down conversations, and organize the details while they were still fresh in my mind. When I returned home that afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook in front of me. I began writing. At first, I only wrote about the wedding. Then other memories came back. Times when Thomas dismissed my opinions. Times when he made decisions without considering my feelings. Times when I stayed quiet because I thought keeping the peace mattered more than speaking honestly. The notebook slowly became more than a collection of events. It became a record of a relationship I had spent years trying to explain. The next day, Thomas called me. His voice sounded relaxed, almost as if nothing had happened. "Margaret, I think you are letting this become something bigger than it is," he said. I listened carefully. The old me would have immediately apologized for feeling hurt. I would have tried to make him comfortable. But this time, I stayed quiet. I let him finish. When he was done, I simply said, "Thomas, I am not trying to create a problem. I am trying to understand the truth." There was a pause. It was a small moment, but it felt important. For the first time, I was not rushing to protect him from an uncomfortable conversation. I was allowing myself to be honest. After the call ended, I looked at the notebook on my table. I knew I was only beginning to uncover the truth. But I also knew something had changed inside me. I was no longer the person who ignored every warning sign just because it came from family. I was finally listening to myself. After my conversation with Thomas, I realized something important. The hardest part was no longer wondering what happened. The hardest part was accepting that I had spent years making excuses for someone who never stopped to consider how his actions affected me. I had always believed that family history created an unbreakable connection. I believed that growing up together, sharing memories, and standing beside each other through difficult times meant something permanent. But I was beginning to understand that history alone does not create respect. Respect is built through choices, and Thomas had been making choices I could no longer ignore. Over the next several days, I continued writing in my notebook. Each page held memories I had pushed aside for years. I wrote about the moments when Thomas made decisions for the family without asking anyone else. I wrote about the times when he spoke over me during conversations. I wrote about the way he seemed uncomfortable whenever attention was placed on someone other than himself. None of these moments seemed important individually. That was why I had ignored them. But together, they told a story I could no longer dismiss. One afternoon, I received a message from Daniel asking if I could meet him again. When I arrived at his office, he had a calm expression and a folder on his desk. He did not rush into the conversation. He simply asked how I was feeling. I appreciated that question, because most people only wanted to know what I planned to do next. Very few people asked how I felt. I told Daniel that I was tired. Not physically tired, but emotionally tired. Tired of always being the person who understood everyone else. Tired of convincing myself that hurtful moments were not important. Tired of believing that speaking up would somehow make me the difficult person in the family. Daniel listened carefully. Then he said, "Margaret, protecting your peace is not the same as creating conflict." That sentence stayed with me. For so long, I had confused silence with kindness. I thought avoiding difficult conversations made me a better family member. But maybe sometimes silence only allows problems to continue. Daniel helped me organize the information I had collected. We reviewed messages, dates, and memories I had written down. There was no anger involved, no desire to embarrass Thomas. I simply wanted clarity. I wanted to understand the situation based on facts rather than emotions. When I returned home that evening, I sat in my living room and looked around. The house was filled with memories from different seasons of my life. There were pictures of my children growing up. There were decorations my husband and I had chosen together. There were reminders of family moments I still treasured. I realized something that surprised me. Standing up for myself did not mean I hated my family. It did not mean I wanted to erase the past. It simply meant I finally believed my own feelings mattered too. The following morning, Thomas sent another message. This time, he sounded frustrated. He asked why I was making things complicated. He said everyone should just move forward. I read the message quietly. I thought about replying immediately, but I stopped myself. I no longer felt the need to defend every emotion I had. I no longer needed to convince someone to understand my pain. Some people only listen when they realize you are no longer asking for permission to be respected. I placed my phone down and returned to my notebook. I wrote one sentence at the top of a new page. The truth does not need to be loud to be powerful. Looking at those words, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. I felt prepared. I did not know exactly how everything would unfold with Thomas, but I knew I was no longer walking into the future carrying the same doubts that had followed me for years. I had spent enough time protecting a relationship that was hurting me. Now it was time to protect myself. The days that followed were quiet, but they were not empty. For the first time in years, I was paying attention to my own thoughts instead of constantly trying to understand everyone else's. I continued my mornings the same way I always had. I made coffee in my small kitchen. I opened the windows to let in the fresh North Carolina air. I watered the flowers in my garden that my husband and I had planted years before. From the outside, nothing about my life looked different. But inside, I was learning how to see things clearly. I had spent so much time believing that family problems should be solved by the person who cared the most. I thought the person who loved the family should be the one willing to compromise. But I was beginning to understand that compromise should not mean accepting disrespect. One afternoon, Megan came to visit me. She brought lunch and sat with me at the kitchen table where I had spent so many hours thinking about everything that happened. She looked at me carefully before speaking. "Mom, I know you do not want to talk badly about Uncle Thomas, but I feel like something has changed." I looked down at my hands for a moment. Megan had always known me well. She knew I was not someone who enjoyed conflict. I had spent most of her life teaching her the importance of kindness and forgiveness. But I also wanted her to understand that kindness required balance. "I am not trying to hurt him," I told her. "I am trying to stop hurting myself." She became quiet. Those words were difficult for me to say because they represented something new. I was finally admitting that my feelings deserved space too. Later that evening, I received a call from Thomas. I almost let it go to voicemail, but I decided to answer. I wanted to hear what he had to say. I wanted to give him the opportunity to be honest. "Margaret, I think this situation has gone too far," he said. His voice sounded calm, but there was frustration underneath it. "I do not understand why you are making this such a serious issue." I listened. I waited. I did not interrupt. In the past, I would have immediately started explaining myself. I would have tried to make him see my point of view. But this time, I simply listened. When he finished speaking, I asked one question. Thomas, do you understand why I felt hurt? There was a pause. A long pause. I think you are focusing too much on the details, he replied. That answer told me more than I expected. He was still looking for a way to explain the situation instead of understanding my experience. I thanked him for talking with me and ended the call. Afterward, I sat in my living room and looked at the old family photographs on the wall. I saw pictures of Thomas and me when we were young. I saw birthdays, holidays, and moments when we were genuinely happy together. I did not want to erase those memories. They were real. But I also had to accept that good memories from the past did not excuse painful choices in the present. The next morning, I met with Daniel again. I told him about the conversation. He listened and then asked me a simple question. Margaret, what do you want the outcome to be? For a moment, I did not know how to answer. My entire life, I had answered questions like that by thinking about what everyone else needed. But this time, I thought about myself. I want honesty, I said. I want people to understand that my feelings matter. Daniel nodded. He explained that the next steps would be handled carefully and respectfully. There would be no public arguments. No unnecessary attention. Everything would be based on facts and communication. When I left his office, I felt something I had not felt since the wedding. I felt calm. I realized I was no longer waiting for Thomas to decide whether I deserved respect. I had already decided that I did. The person who had spent years staying quiet was finally learning that a peaceful heart and a strong voice could exist together. I thought the hardest part would be standing up for myself. I was wrong. The hardest part was accepting that I could no longer return to the version of myself who ignored every uncomfortable moment just to keep the peace. For so many years, I believed that family loyalty meant staying quiet. I believed that love meant giving people endless chances. But as I sat at my kitchen table one quiet morning, looking at the notes I had written over the past few weeks, I realized something important. Protecting a relationship should never require losing respect for yourself. I continued organizing everything I had collected. I reviewed conversations, dates, and memories carefully. I was not searching for reasons to be angry at Thomas. I was searching for clarity. There was a difference. Anger can make people act without thinking. Clarity allows people to make decisions with purpose. Daniel reminded me of that during our next meeting. He looked through the information I had gathered and explained that emotions were understandable, but facts were what mattered. I appreciated the way he spoke to me. He never treated me like someone who was helpless. He treated me like someone who had the ability to make her own choices. That meant more to me than he probably realized. After leaving Daniel's office, I stopped at a small park near my home. I sat on a bench and watched families walking together. Children were laughing. Couples were enjoying the afternoon. It reminded me that family could be complicated, but it could also be beautiful. I did not want Thomas's actions to change the way I viewed every relationship in my life. I only wanted to stop allowing one person's choices to control my peace. That evening, Thomas sent another message. This time, he asked why I was involving other people. He said family problems should stay within the family. I read the message slowly. That sentence would have hurt me deeply in the past. But now I saw it differently. Thomas was not asking for understanding. He was asking for silence. He wanted everything to disappear without anyone acknowledging what happened. I placed my phone on the counter and walked away. I did not respond immediately. I had learned that not every message deserved an emotional reaction. The next day, I spoke with Megan again. She asked if I was certain about moving forward. I could hear concern in her voice. She loved both of us, and I understood how difficult it was for her to watch a family relationship change. I do not want revenge, I told her. I just want to know that I am allowed to protect myself. Megan reached across the table and held my hand. Mom, you are allowed to matter too, she said. Those words stayed with me, because for most of my life, I had measured my worth by how much I could do for others. I was the person who remembered everything, the person who showed up, the person who made sacrifices without expecting anything in return. But I had forgotten that I was also someone who deserved consideration. A few days later, Daniel called me with an update. He explained that the next step was ready. Everything would be handled calmly and professionally. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no attempt to embarrass Thomas, only a clear statement that my boundaries mattered. I sat quietly after the call ended. I looked around my home and thought about how much had changed since my wedding day. The woman who returned home confused and disappointed was not the same woman sitting there now. I still had compassion. I still valued family. But I finally understood that compassion without boundaries could become a way of abandoning yourself. Thomas believed my kindness meant I would always forgive and forget. He believed my quiet nature meant I would never challenge him. But he had misunderstood something about me. My silence was never because I had nothing to say. My silence was because I was waiting until I understood exactly what needed to be said. The morning everything changed was surprisingly ordinary. There was no dramatic moment.
No argument.
No raised voices. Just a quiet morning in my home in North Carolina, with sunlight coming through the kitchen window and a cup of coffee sitting beside me. I remember looking at the envelope on the table and realizing that this was the moment when I stopped waiting for Thomas to understand and started accepting that I needed to protect myself. For years, I had hoped that if I explained my feelings clearly enough, people would eventually see the pain they caused. I believed that if someone truly loved you, they would recognize when they had gone too far. But sometimes people only understand the importance of your boundaries when those boundaries finally exist. I opened the envelope carefully and reviewed the documents Daniel had prepared. Everything was written clearly and respectfully. There were no angry accusations, no emotional words meant to create more conflict. It was simply a statement of what happened and a request for accountability. Looking at those pages, I thought about how different this was from the person I used to be. The old Margaret would have hidden the envelope in a drawer. She would have convinced herself that protecting family harmony was more important than protecting her own dignity. But the woman sitting at that table was different. She was still kind. She was still someone who believed in forgiveness. But she had finally learned that forgiveness did not mean allowing the same pain to continue. Daniel handled everything professionally. He reminded me that my goal was not to hurt Thomas. My goal was to make sure my voice was heard. That distinction mattered to me. I did not want Thomas to suffer. I wanted him to understand. There is a difference between revenge and accountability. Revenge comes from wanting someone else to feel pain. Accountability comes from wanting the truth to be recognized. A few days later, Thomas received the official communication. I knew the moment he saw it, he would be surprised. Not because the situation was unfair, but because he never expected me to take action. He had spent years seeing me as the person who would always forgive, always adjust, and always move on. He had mistaken my patience for permission. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was Thomas. I looked at the screen for several seconds before answering. Part of me remembered all the years we had shared, the childhood memories, the family holidays, the moments when I truly believed we would always stand together. But another part of me remembered the feeling of sitting alone after my wedding, wondering why I had ignored my own instincts for so long. "Margaret, what is this?" he asked. His voice was different. The confidence I had heard so many times before was quieter now. It is a reminder that my feelings matter too, I said. There was a pause. Thomas started explaining again. He said I was taking things too seriously. He said he never intended for anything to become a problem. I listened carefully. Then I asked him a question I had wanted to ask for a long time. Thomas, when did you decide that my feelings were less important than keeping things comfortable for everyone else? He did not answer immediately. That silence told me more than any words could have. I was not looking for a perfect apology anymore. I was looking at the truth. When the conversation ended, I sat quietly for a while. I expected to feel sadness. I expected to feel regret. Instead, I felt peace. Not because everything was fixed. Not because my relationship with Thomas suddenly became easy. I felt peace because I finally stopped fighting against what I already knew. I could not control his choices. I could not force him to see himself differently. I could only control how I responded. And for the first time in years, I responded with respect for myself. Thomas thought he knew exactly who I was. He thought I was the woman who would always step aside to keep everyone else comfortable. He never realized that beneath all those years of patience was a strength he had never noticed. I thought I would feel different after everything was finally out in the open. I thought I would wake up one morning and suddenly feel like the entire situation was behind me. But healing does not happen in one single moment. It happens slowly, through small decisions and quiet realizations. In the weeks that followed, I learned that peace does not always come from fixing a relationship. Sometimes peace comes from accepting what a relationship has become. My connection with Thomas changed. There was no dramatic ending.
No final argument.
No moment where everything was magically repaired. Instead, there was distance. A space that allowed both of us to see the situation more clearly. For the first time in many years, I stopped trying to carry the entire responsibility for keeping our relationship alive. I had always been the one who called first after disagreements. I had always been the one who found reasons to forgive. I had always been the one who believed that if I showed enough patience, everything would eventually return to normal. But I finally understood that a relationship cannot be repaired by one person alone. It requires honesty from both sides. A few weeks later, Megan came to visit me. We sat on the back porch overlooking my garden, the same garden where I often went when I needed time to think. The afternoon was quiet. Birds were singing in the distance, and the warm North Carolina breeze moved through the trees. "Mom, I think you seem happier," Megan said. I smiled because I knew exactly what she meant. I was not happier because of what happened with Thomas. I was happier because I was no longer fighting against my own feelings. I think I finally stopped trying to convince myself that everything was okay, I told her. Megan nodded. She understood more than I expected. She had watched me spend years putting everyone else first. She had seen me forgive people before they even apologized. She had seen me take responsibility for problems that were never mine to carry. "You taught me to be kind," she said. "But I think you are teaching me something else now. You are teaching me that kindness also includes yourself." Those words touched me deeply, because she was right. I had spent so much time teaching others about compassion that I forgot to offer some of that compassion to myself. That evening, I walked through my house and noticed how peaceful it felt. The same walls, the same furniture, the same memories, but I was seeing everything differently. I no longer saw my home as a place where I had to keep everything perfect for everyone else. I saw it as a place where I could finally be honest. Thomas eventually reached out again. His message was shorter this time. He did not make jokes. He did not dismiss my feelings. He simply asked if we could talk. I sat with that message for a while. Part of me wanted to immediately say yes because that was what I had always done. I wanted to believe that this was the moment everything would change. But I also knew that real change required more than a conversation. It required understanding. We eventually spoke on the phone. The conversation was calm. Thomas admitted that he had not realized how much his actions had affected me. It was not the perfect apology I once imagined. It did not erase the past, but it was the first time I felt like he was actually listening. I told him that I did not expect everything to go back to the way it was before.
Some things take time.
Trust is not rebuilt with a single conversation. It is rebuilt through consistent choices. After we ended the call, I sat outside and watched the sunset over my backyard. I thought about everything that had happened since my wedding day. I thought about the woman who once believed staying quiet was the only way to keep her family together. I thought about the woman I had become. Someone who still loved her family, but no longer disappeared to make others comfortable. I finally understood that protecting yourself does not mean you have stopped caring about others. Sometimes it means you have finally learned that you matter too. When I look back at everything that happened, I realized the most important change was not what happened between Thomas and me. The most important change was what happened inside me. For many years, I believed being a good family member meant always being available. I believed love meant accepting everything without question. I believed keeping peace meant making sure everyone else was comfortable, even if I was the one quietly carrying the weight. But life has a way of teaching us lessons when we are finally ready to listen. I learned that respecting yourself is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of honesty. Months had passed since my wedding day, and my life had settled into a new rhythm. I spent more time enjoying simple moments. I read books in the mornings. I worked in my garden. I met friends for coffee and conversations that lasted longer than planned. I laughed more. Not because my life became perfect, but because I was no longer spending every moment worrying about someone else's approval.
My
Relationship with Thomas was different. It was not the same as before, and maybe it never would be. Some changes cannot be undone. Some words cannot be forgotten. But I no longer carried anger toward him. Anger had taken enough for me already. I did not want to spend the next chapter of my life holding on to something that kept me connected to pain. Instead, I chose understanding.
I chose acceptance.
I chose peace. Thomas and I slowly began having occasional conversations again. They were not long conversations, filled with promises. They were small moments where we both learned how to communicate differently. I noticed that he was more careful with his words. I noticed that he listened more. And I also noticed something about myself. I no longer felt the need to prove why I was hurt. I no longer needed someone else to confirm that my feelings were valid. I already knew they were. One afternoon, Megan visited me, and we sat outside in the garden. She looked around and smiled. "Mom, this place feels different," she said. I looked around too. The flowers were blooming. The sunlight was warm. The house felt peaceful. "Maybe the place is the same," I told her. "Maybe I am the one who changed." She smiled because she understood. I had not become a different person. I had simply stopped hiding parts of myself to make other people comfortable. I still believed in forgiveness. I still believed family mattered. I still believed people could grow and change. But I also believed something I had never fully understood before. Love without respect is incomplete. Family without honesty becomes painful. And forgiveness without boundaries can become another way of hurting yourself. I thought about the woman I was on my wedding day. She was hopeful. She was loving. She wanted everyone to be happy. I did not judge her for trusting too easily. That woman had survived difficult years, raised a family, and given her heart completely. She deserved compassion too. But I was grateful for the woman I became afterward. A woman who learned that her voice mattered. A woman who learned that being kind did not mean being silent forever. A woman who understood that age does not take away your
Strength.
Sometimes age gives you the wisdom to finally use it. Looking back, I do not see my experience with Thomas as the moment my family broke apart. I see it as the moment I finally stopped losing myself while trying to hold everything together. I did not need to win a battle. I did not need everyone to choose my side. I only needed to stand firmly in my own truth. And that was enough. Because after a lifetime of putting everyone else first, I finally understood something simple. I was always worthy of the same love, patience, and respect that I had spent my entire life giving to others.